Before we begin, if you enjoy these quiet, strange stories from history, the ones nobody else tells, consider subscribing. It helps this channel grow and lets me keep making free sleep videos like this one. You can even drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you're listening from. I read every one now. Let's begin. Asterisk, it is just past sunrise. The air over the city of Isfahan is still cool and still. The executioner has not spoken a word since waking. That is the custom. No words before the blade. His first act of the day is not to check his tools, nor to dress. Not yet. First, he eats, always in silence, always alone. But what, you may ask, does a Persian royal executioner eat before carrying out his grim duties? Not dates, not sweet fruit, not even much meat. The truth is far simpler. The record books, scant and scattered though they are, paint a modest picture. A bowl of barley porridge, a slice of sour flatbread soaked in vinegar, pinch of salt, taken slowly, and often though not always a single boiled egg, halved not to be chewed, but pressed gently between the tongue and the roof of the mouth until it softened into paste. This meal was more ritual than nourishment, so it was never too hot or too cold. It was not to be rushed nor indulged. It was the meal of someone about to hold death in their hands, okay? And it had to sit quietly in the stomach, no spices, no grease, no aromas that might distract the senses or stir the nerves. Why? Because the executioner's work required calm hands, a clear mind, and an empty heart, but not too empty. These men, really women, were not heartless. On the contrary, Persian courts often chose their executioners with care, preferring those who understood the seriousness of their role. They were not mere brutes, they were public servants. Their job was not only to kill but to do so cleanly, efficiently, with the least suffering possible. The ancient Persian ideal was not spectacle, but solemnity. A botched beheading was an offense not only to the condemned, but to the court, the gods, and the rhythm of justice itself. That is why the executioner's breakfast mattered. Not in the way modern people think of breakfast as fuel, but as ritual preparation, like a priest preparing for sacrifice. And unlike soldiers or guards who ate together and joked before duty, executioners dined alone, not for fear of judgment, but to preserve their internal silence. We know this from scattered court diaries and travelers' accounts. A French physician visiting Persia in the early 1700s described a curious figure who left the palace kitchens at dawn each day, carrying a small cloth bundle and walking with studied steps toward the outer quarters. I followed him, the doctor wrote, thinking him some errant boy. But I was told later that he bore the meal of the headsman and that none may speak to him once the cloth is untied. There were reasons for this silence. The meal had to settle, to root the body. It had to align the mind with the work ahead. The slow carbohydrates from barley, quinoa, to awaken the senses. The salt for balance, the egg for protein. It was a poor man's feast, but rich in symbolism. Barley was sacred in Zoroastrian thought, the crop of order and balance. Emigre, with its sting, was believed to cut through evil humors. Salt warded off spirits, and the egg. The egg was life itself, briefly held, briefly hold, broken, a quiet reminder of the day's task. But where did these customs begin? Some say they date back to the Achaemenid Empire, though records are faint. Others trace them to the Sassanids, who codified so many aspects of Persian court life. Yet, it is in the Qajar era, particularly the 19th century, we find the clearest descriptions. During this time, executioners were officially employed by the state and given rank, rations, and protection. They had their own kitchens, quarters, and codes, and their meals were documented, though always with a kind of hushed reverence in one surviving account. A scribe notes that the man of the blade takes his barley before the hour of sunstrike, swallows, not before the silence is complete. What did that mean? Possibly, it referred to the moment just before the courtyard fills with guards, petitions, and spectators. The executioner had to be done eating before then. His body must be still when others began to move. He must be full, but not burdened. But what of the days when he could not eat? Yes, there were days like that too. Days when executions coincided with fasts or holy observances. Days when death was scheduled, but hunger had to be maintained. On such mornings, the executioner still sat at the same low table, still untied the same cloth, but he did not eat. Instead, he gazed out sometimes. He would pour water into a bowl and watch it settle, or he would break the bread and set it aside. A fast observed, but the ritual maintained. There is something haunting in that Jet man, staring at a bowl he will not touch, preparing to touch something far colder. But perhaps the strangest aspect of all was this: the executioner's food was often prepared by someone else. Not a wife, not a servant, but an apprentice. Apprenticeship in Persian executioner circles was long and slow. You did not touch a blade for years. Instead, you learned the rhythms of preparation, cleaning, observation, silence, and yes, cooking. To cook for the master was to understand his balance, to watch his moods, to see what the day required. A little more salt if the condemned was highborn, a thinner porridge if there were multiple executions to perform. These were not whims. They were tools of the trade. The apprentice cooked not for flavor but for focus. You might imagine then how quietly the small kitchen in the executioner's wing must have run. No clangs, no chatter, only the scrape of spoon against pot, the rustle of cloth, and then silence. By the time the sun rose high, the breakfast was long gone, the bowl wiped clean, the bread folded neatly in linen, eaten in its slow, dissolving way, and the executioner dressed, but not yet armed. For the blade had its own ritual, and its own story. And if the breakfast was a prayer to begin the day, what was the act of sharpening, if not a second kind of meditation? Asterisk, the meal is done. The bowl has been rinsed. The cloth has been folded and placed precisely at the corner of the low cedar table. There are no crumbs, no scraps, no scent in the air. Even the steam from the porridge is gone now. The food has passed from ritual to memory. The executioner stands. His garments are still plain. A dark tunic tied with a dull cord, clean linen trousers, and worn leather sandals with stitched soles silent on the tile. He does not wear the robes of ceremony yet. Those come later. First comes the steel. But before that, his hands. The Persian executioner washed his hands 3 times before ever touching the blade. Not with soap, but with water from a copper basin poured by the apprentice. The water must not be too cold, stiffens the joints, or too warm, which can numb the sensitivity of fingers. Lukewarm water only. First the left hand, then the right, then both together, held still over the bowl until the final drops fell. This practice was not about hygiene, though it served that too. It was about readiness, about touch. A good executioner could feel the weight of a blade just by lifting the cloth it rested beneath. He knew if a tool had been disturbed, even slightly. The washing reminded the hands that they were not ordinary. Today, they were the instruments of precision, of balance, of finality. Now came the moment of unveiling. The sharpening kit was never kept in plain sight. It was wrapped in layer-soft linen to prevent rust, then thick felt to absorb impact, and finally a lacquered wooden box tied with plain rope. It was not hidden, but neither was it displayed. The act of unwrapping was as deliberate as the meal. And what did this kit contain? Not what you might think. There were no monstrous axes, no serrated horrors. The primary blade used for clean decapitation was not even especially large, about the length of a forearm, slightly curved, single-edged. Its steel, if Persian-made, may have come from Yazd or Shiraz. Known for their quality metallurgy, sometimes imported blades were used Damascus steel, if gifted. But often, the blade that killed was also the blade that had been used for years, maintained carefully by the same hands that used it. Next to the blade was the strop, a long strip of oil. This, too, was a form of meditation. Executioners did not sharpen quickly. They sharpened with focus. Each pass of the blade along the stone was paired with breath. Some held their breath. Others exhaled. No one spoke. Even apprentices stood still. In many ways, this was the true beginning of the workday. Not the moment the blade struck, but this moment, where the executioner sat alone with his tools, touching death with reverence. In some courts, particularly in the Safavid period, the sharpening process was overseen by scribes or record keepers who documented the maintenance of state tools. But the executioner was the one who determined readiness. No one else. The blade was not right. The execution did not proceed. This power, quiet as it was, meant the executioner could delay an act of state violence by claiming the steel was not ready. Whether this was a spiritual belief or subtle resistance, we do not always know. But the historical record shows that on at least 3 occasions in the 1600s, royal executions were postponed by a single man, sharpening his blade in silence. There was also the matter of balance. A well-maintained executioner's blade was not just sharp, was weighted to arc cleanly with the motion of the body. Too light, and it would bounce. It's too heavy, and it would drive too deep. The goal was a single cut. One strike, no corrections. Not for the sake of cruelty, but mercy. And so, executioners practiced, not on people, but on melons. Large, dense Persian melons, grown in the fields outside Shiraz and Qom. Their flesh was said to resemble the tension of muscle and sinew. A clean cut through the melon meant readiness. The apprentice would bring 3. The executioner would choose 1. He would not rush. He would set the melon on a small wooden block and wait for his hands to still. Then, with one motion, one only, he would test the blade. If the melon cleaved silently, falling apart in equal halves, the blade was ready. If not, sharpening resumed. There is something deeply human in this process. Something so quiet, so careful, that it almost obscures the gravity of what followed. But perhaps that was the point. The act of killing was terrible. The preparation had to be calm, measured, almost boring. Once the blade was approved, it was oiled, wrapped again, and placed in a cloth satchel, never hung at the waist, never displayed. The executioner carried it like a sacred object. He did not let it swing. He did not allow others to touch it. He would now dress. The ceremonial garments were not elaborate. A heavier tunic, usually black or deep red, case, sandals, and sometimes a hood or a face covering, depending on the audience. In early Qajar times, the face was bare. Later, partial veils were introduced, especially for executions in large public spaces. At this point, the apprentice became silent entirely. No further questions, no final preparations. The master's body was ready. His mind was set. The food was digested. The blade was prepared. And yet, not all executions happened at once. Sometimes the executioner would wait for hours before being summoned. In such cases, he would sit in the shadows of the palace wall, holding a clay cup of water, sipping only when the sun moved past a certain pillar. Even waiting was a ritual. And in that waiting, that long silence between the morning meal and the stroke of steel, a strange question lingers. How many times did the executioner sharpen a blade for someone he did not want to kill? Asterisk, The courtyard was nearly empty. Only the sound of sandals on polished stone echoed through the archways. The executioner walked alone, his blade wrapped tightly beneath his arm. There were no guards to escort him. He did not need them. His presence was enough. The apprentices followed at a distance, silent, careful, trained to step on the edges of the stone tiles to avoid unnecessary sound. This was not the scaffold yet. This was the approach, the walk from the executioner's quarters to the public square, whether in Isfahan, Shiraz, or Kazvin, was deliberate, slow, even meditative. Persian records show it could take anywhere from 12 to 30 minutes, depending on the location of the gallows or platform, but it was never hurried. No one dared urge him forward, not even the palace guards. He walked like someone attending a sacred rite, tamed in a way. He was the final act of justice in many Persian cities, especially during the Safavid and Qajar dynasties. It was carried out, not in secret, but in plain view. A public space, a timed event, a demonstration of the Shah's authority, but also of order and solemnity. The executioner was not just a killer. He was the closing statement of the day's law. By the time he arrived, the crowd was already gathered. Vendors had closed their stalls. Mothers held their children close. Elders sat on steps. There was no shouting, no music, no loud declarations. In the Persian tradition, executions were not for spectacle. They were not designed to draw bloodlust from the public. They were a display of control, of divine justice, and ideally, of mercy through precision. That is why the executioner was watched so closely. One misstep, 1 second strike, one moment of hesitation would not only shame the executioner, but dishonor the Shah himself. The public watched, not just for the act, but for the grace of the act, for its sharpness, its clarity. And so the executioner ascended the platform, blade still hidden. He did not raise it. He did not speak. His apprentices moved to the sides, out of view. They would clean later. But for now, the stage was his alone. The condemned was already kneeling. Perhaps it was a noble guilty of treason or theft from the court. Perhaps a rebel. Perhaps simply someone who had angered the wrong vizier. The reasons varied. The outcome did not. The executioner removed his sandals before stepping onto the inner carpet of the platform. This was a custom specific to the court-appointed executioners of Isfahan. It symbolized that he was now stepping into sacred space, space between worlds. He knelt once, quietly, then stood, then turned. Only now did he unwrap the blade. If the wind was high, he turned slightly away so that dust would not cling to the steel. If the air was still, he waited an extra moment, letting the sunlight catch the edge, warming the grip in his hand. There are records from the 18th century of a traveling English merchant who witnessed such a moment. He wrote, "The man removed his sandals and bowed not to the crowd, nor to the king, but perhaps to the instrument itself. I swear to you, it glinted like a needle of silver. He did not raise it. He barely moved. And yet the man's head was gone before I even realized the stroke had fallen." That was the goal. Speed, precision, stillness, in a world of chaos and constant threat. This moment, this quiet act of terrible exactness was meant to remind everyone that the law could still be smooth, still be clean. The death had to feel inevitable, like gravity, not fury. And afterward, the executioner did not linger. There were no speeches, no cheers. He stepped down, wrapped the blade again, took the cloth in both hands, walked away. Often, a cup of water would be offered by a young attendant before he crossed the edge of the square. Sometimes he took it, sometimes he did not. If he did, he poured a few drops to the earth before drinking, as if returning a portion of the day back to the soil. He would not eat again until sunset. This was another part of the ritual, less spoken, but widely followed. After an execution, the stomach was left empty until the light was gone. There are references to this practice in oral accounts, in minor poems written by scribes and servants. A form of fasting, a way of creating distance between what had happened and what came next. And the apprentices, they returned separately. One carried a cloth to collect and clean the blade. One remained behind to tend the space, washing the stone, folding the carpet, restoring the square. It was said that if the carpet was folded without a wrinkle, the next execution would go cleanly too. A superstition, perhaps, simply the habit of people trying to bring order to a world where death walked barefoot and silent. By evening, the executioner returned to his room. He removed his tunic, washed again, lit a small oil lamp, sat at the same low table where he had eaten barley that morning, and did nothing. Not always, but often, he did nothing. He did not sharpen. He did not write. He did not speak. He simply waited for night to come. Many modern historians wonder how these men lived with themselves. Quote, in Persian culture, the role was understood differently. The executioner was not a villain, nor a hero. At first glance, the bazaar had nothing to do with death. It was a place of color, of scent, of folded cloth, and haggling voices. Vendors shouted prices. Customers sniffed at baskets of dried herbs. Boys darted between stalls with trays of rosewater and walnut cakes. Beneath the arched roof of the spice quarter in Shiraz, the air was always thick with cardamom, saffron, turmeric, K, and dried lime. But if you knew what to look for, if you listened for silence rather than sound, you might notice the quiet booth near the third waterspout, where no shouting happened. Just a man in gray robes, measuring powders with a spoon carved from apricot wood. He sold no perfumes. He offered no sweets. His stall held only a few items: salt in small jars, crushed coriander in tightly sealed linen, vinegar in blackened glass, and near the back, wrapped in triple cloth and unlabeled powder, the color of dull ash. Few asked about it, but those who did never asked twice. This was the booth that supplied the scaffold. You see, Persian executioners never worked alone. Not truly. Behind every clean stroke, every silent ritual, every tightly folded cloth, there were others unseen, unacknowledged, but vital. And among them, the spice merchant held one of the most unusual roles in the system of state execution. Not because he prepared poisons. That was another man's job. Not because he treated wounds. That was a surgeon's task. The spice merchant did something more mundane and more vital. He controlled smell. Why? 'Cause death smells. Not always, but often. Especially in the summer. Especially in crowded squares where blood soaked into stone and lingered under the heat. And especially when more than one body fell in a single morning. The executioner could not smell of death. His presence had to be clean, ordered, sacred. The blade stank of blood, or the executioner's sleeves held the scent of rot or bile. The act was no longer solemn, it became grotesque. So the merchant intervened. He provided three things, and three only: a fine powdered lime and vinegar mix, meant to scatter under the platform after use. It absorbed blood, neutralized scent, and masked the air with a sharp, clean sting. A rinse made from saffron stems and boiled quince skin, used to wipe the blade without leaving residue or rust. And a mix known only as courtyards, the calming dust, was sprinkled lightly around the base of the execution site. Smell was mild, earthy, slightly sweet, made from crushed myrtle leaves, dried rose hips, and a trace of cardamom husk. It did not mask the event, softened it. It is a strange thing to scent an execution. But in the Persian worldview, every act had its place. Every place had its scent. Weddings smelled of rosewater, prayers of frankincense, courts of ink and silk, and public death had to be marked not only by sound or sight, but by smell. a clean scent, and ordered one. That was this merchant's job. He was not called to testify. He was never named in records, okay? But payments to spice merchants appear in the margins of many court budgets. One line reads, 2 rials for the dust of the scaffold per act. And what kind of man did this? Not the loud vendor selling cinnamon by the handful, not the boy crushing chilies with a mortar stone. The scaffold spice merchant was quiet, precise, often older, often childless. His shop was clean, bare, meticulously arranged. He did not offer samples. His customers were few and chosen. Some were court officials, some were guards, but most were apprentices sent by the executioner to collect the weekly packet. And those packets were never labeled. They were wrapped in white cotton, tied with a plain string. No wax, no ink, no seal. One court observer from the 19th century described such a delivery. A youth in dark robes approached the booth and said only, "For morning." The man nodded, vanished behind his curtain, and returned with a cloth. No coin changed hands in view. The boy bowed once and left. For morning. That meant the execution was scheduled. It meant the powders must be ready. The blade would be wiped. The square would be scattered with scent. And the people would come, never realizing they were breathing in the work of an invisible hand. There is something deeply Persian in this idea, that even the worst moment of public killing should be marked with dignity. That the world should not descend into stench and filth, but be preserved with ritual. That a man should lose his head, but not his smell. We forget how closely ancient cultures tied scent to divinity. In Zoroastrian tradition, pure smell was associated with Ushi truth, order, the natural law. Foul smell was drudge falsehood, chaos, decay. Even in death, the difference mattered. And so, this merchant walked a strange line. He did not cause death. He did not judge guilt, but his powders determined how the living experienced the moment. It said that in some courts, when a new Shah was crowned, he received 3 gifts from the officials of the inner circle: a ceremonial robe, a seal of justice, and a packet from the spice merchantine labeled, but familiar, as if to say, power carries a scent. Do not let it rot. The merchant, of course, never attended an execution that would break the line of detachment, but he walked past him, always, just before the hour, always carrying a cloth parcel, always turning away just before the platform came into view. Some say he whispered prayers as he passed, not for the condemned, but for the smell, because in his mind, perhaps the worst part of death wasn't the blade. It was the memory left behind in the air. And so now we wonder, when the crowds left the square, did they remember the execution or the smell that lingered in its place? Asterisk, in a corner of the Shiraz Bazaar, behind the curtain of a spice stall that bore no sign, sat a wooden chest that hadn't been opened in years. It wasn't locked, didn't need to be. Those who knew what it contained never wished to open it. Those who didn't even notice it. Inside the chest were cloth-bound ledgers, their pages blank, not empty blank. That is, they weren't used for writing. The cloth was used to wrap the formulas. Each merchant of the scaffold had his own version of the kiki arm or dust of calm. The recipe was never written down, not once, not in the archives of the court, not in any surviving merchant's log, and yet it was passed down one generation to the next, not in ink, but by smell. You see, in the world of Persian scents, words were too clumsy. How do you describe a powder that must smell like neither mourning nor celebration? Too sweet, and the square becomes disrespectful. It's too bitter, and the crowd grows restless. Too sharp, and it overwhelms. It's too soft, and it is lost beneath the wind. It had to be exact. And exact, in this case, meant something deeply human-tuned, to the emotions of 1,000 nostrils breathing in at once. So the master merchants used cloth, each square of white cotton stored inside that chest held a trace amount of the base blend, never exposed to light, never handled with bare fingers. These were scent memory pads. When it was time to train an apprentice, the master would unwrap the first cloth, hold it under the student's nose, and say nothing. The apprentice had to memorize that scent. Then came the second, slightly stronger, slightly rounder, and the third, which added a warmth that was hard to place, maybe dried quince skin, maybe crushed apricot pit. The fourth cloth was held back for months. That one contained the rare bass note, used only when executions involved royalty or religious offenses. The scent was deeper, dustier, like old silk burned at the edges. Training an apprentice took a full year, and it wasn't about blending, it was about listening to how air moved through a market square, how different scents shifted between morning and noon, how the smell of horse sweat, leather, hot bread, or old copper might interfere with the execution dust. Each formula had to complement the world, no fight it, and each powder had a base, usually fine ground dried rose hips, because rose scent anchored the public to familiarity. 2 weddings, 2 prayer halls. But then came the modifier's myrtle leaf to cool the sweetness, black tea dust to weight the air, dried lime peel for brightness, and just a touch of saffron stem knot for luxury, but for steadiness. The stem, not the flower. The petals were too volatile, but the trick, the detail that no apprentice ever spoke aloud, was the binder. The powder had to settle, not scatter. It had to remain grounded beneath the scaffold, even when hundreds of sandals stirred the dust. So a trace amount of chickpea flour was added, not enough to affect the scent, just enough to hold shape. In modern laboratories, this might sound trivial. Of course it did. That was the design. But not all executions were the same. Not all powders were used. There was one blend called Kiki Sard, the coal dust, used only when executions followed betrayal. It was cooler, a trace of mint, powdered stone, even ground date seed. It was rare. Some merchants never made it. Some were forbidden to. It was said to strip all warmth from the air. Not even birds lingered near the square when that dust was used. Only the most experienced apprentices could prepare it. It required no heat. The mixing was done at night, by moonlight, and it had to be sifted through silk 5 times before it could be stored, and it was never inhaled directly. The merchant who handled KHK, Isard, would hold the packet with a cloth and bow slightly before placing it into the apprentice's bag, not out of reverence, but respect, like handling cold iron. But here's the most peculiar thing of all. There are reports, quiet ones, of families coming to the spice merchant days after an execution, not to protest, not to ask questions, to request a small cloth of the dust. Why? To remember, to grieve, to sit with the smell that accompanied the death of their father, brother, son. It was not common. It was not advertised. But if the merchant trusted the requestive, the family came with calm hearts and soft words. He would wrap a tiny pinch in cloth and offer it without a word. They would take it home, place it in the corner, and in the months that followed, when grief became too soft or too abstract, they would unwrap the cloth, inhale once, and remember the scent of the square, not the blood, not the face of the executioner, not even the crime, just the smell, because in Persian memory, scent mattered. A well-balanced powder could hold not just odor, but time itself. And so we are left to wonder, what do we forget when we erase the smell? And what lingers unseen, unsaid, when a powder once used for silence remains folded in cloth, hidden in a chest no one dares open? Asterisk, by the time the Courtyard dynasty reached its final decades, the world had begun to change. Steamships arrived at Persian ports. Telegraph lines stretched like strange metal vines across the mountains. Courtrooms echoed with new languages: French, Russian, English, and with them came new ideas about law, about punishment, about what justice should smell like. And for the first time in generations, the scaffold began to smell wrong. It started subtly. The crowds in Tehran and Shiraz began to shift their gaze from the executioner to the surroundings. Whispers spread not about the crime or the condemned, but about the air. Why did it smell sweeter than usual? Why did it cling to the throat instead of calming it? The powders weren't working. The new public squares were paved with stone instead of packed earth. That alone changed how scent moved. There were fewer trees to catch the wind, fewer shaded alleys to temper the sun. The heat rose faster. The blood dried quicker, and the carefully layered dust, so delicately designed for mud and breeze, now sat useless on hot flagstones. The merchant noticed first. He had measured the usual proportions: rosehip, lime, quince, bark. He had sifted them through muslin. He had added the chickpea flour. But when the apprentice returned that day, his eyes looked ... unsure. The dust clung to the blade. He said, "That wasn't supposed to happen." The cloth that usually wrapped the blade cleanly had dark streaks of sticky residue. The scent hadn't lifted, it had settled. The merchant frowned. His hands moved over the jars again. He remeasured. He sniffed. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had changed. The same week, a court official approached the booth. He did not speak the coded phrases, did not wear the expected robes. He asked directly, bluntly, "Can you make something stronger?" Stronger. The merchant blinked. Stronger was not a word used in this trade. Scent was not perfume. It was balance, restraint. But the court wanted more now. A scent to overpower, a scent to mask, not calm. The new foreign advisors thought blood should be hidden, not dignified. So the merchant tried. He began experimenting with unfamiliar elements. Dried tamarind for sharpness, crushed violet petals for depth, even powdered camphor imported at great expense. But the results were strange. The tamarind overpowered the vinegar. The violet clung to the palate. The camphor made old men cough and children cry for the first time in over a century. The powders were being rejected, and still the executions continued. One morning, after a high-profile execution in the Tehran square, the merchant walked past the site an hour later. He always did this. It was his quiet ritual, confirming that the scent had settled. But this time, it hadn't. The air was acrid, sharp, but not from his blend. The guards had burned oil near the scaffold, incense imported from Europe, thick with resin and unfamiliar musk. It overpowered everything. The crowd had thinned, quickly, coughing, and the cloth the apprentice had folded was stained. It's black around the edges. The merchant said nothing. He returned to his booth, opened the old chest, looked at the blank cloths, now yellowed with time. He did something no one expected. He removed the fourth cloth, the one with the rare scent used for royal betrayals, and he burned it. Not in anger, not in protest, but as a signal. The scent was no longer needed, or perhaps no longer understood. In the years that followed, the position of the scaffold spice merchant was quietly dissolved. No decree, no announcement, just fewer visits. No more apprentices. The booth stayed open for a time, selling ordinary spices. Now, cumin, dried mint, lemon rind. But those who remembered the old guards, the former apprentices, would still lower their voice near the third waterspout, still nod slightly when they passed the corner stall, because they remembered a time when scent was law, when a powder could calm 1,000 hearts, when the sharp air after a death was not acid, but order. And then there was the day, the last day, when the executioner himself arrived at the booth. It was early. The sun had not yet touched the stall's curtain. He did not wear his ceremonial robe. just a plain tunic, bare hands, no blade. The merchant offered nothing. They stood in silence. Then the executioner reached into his pocket and pulled out a pouch or cloth bundle, old, worn, tied and twined. He placed it on the counter. The merchant did not open it. They looked at each other, not like partners, not like friends, but like two men who had shared something sacred, something now broken. Then the executioner turned, walked into the bazaar, and disappeared into the crowd. The pouch remained. The merchant picked it up, smelled it, not the powder, but the absence of it. It smelled like stone, like sweat, like smoke. It smelled like forgetting. That day, the merchant closed early, and that night, in a dark room behind the stall, he unwrapped the oldest cloth in his chest, first blend he had ever made. He inhaled once, just once, then folded it tightly and placed it beneath the floorboards. A powder, not for death, but for memory. And so, centuries later, we are left to ask, when the rituals fade, and the air changes, and the dust no longer settles, what lingers in the places where Sit used to speak? Asterisk, in the narrow alleys behind the central square of Casbin, away from the noise of the silk market and the saffron stalls, there was another kind of market, a quieter one, less colorful, less fragrant, but no less essential. This was the butcher's quarter. And while it lacked the elegance of the apothecary's or the ornate pride of the scribe's district, it possessed a quiet kind of power, the kind of power that comes from routine, repetition, and respect for flesh. Each morning, well before the mosque called the faithful to prayer, the butchers were already awake, cutting, weighing, preparing animals for the day's meat. Goats, mostly, sometimes lamb, occasionally larger beasts. They worked in silence, in rhythm, guided by habit more than thought. And among them, if you watched long enough, you might catch a glimpse of a man who didn't quite belong. His robe was cleaner than the rest, his blade shorter. He never spoke, never bartered, never laughed like the others did when the carts tipped or the cats meowed too loudly. He didn't carry coin. Instead, he carried a wooden box under one arm long, narrow, wrapped in plain cloth. This man was not a butcher. He was an executioner, and he had come to learn. It might sound strange now, even offensive, but in Safavid Persia, and later during the KR era, there was an unspoken exchange between two very different professions, the state executioners and the butchers who carved animals for food. The connection wasn't official. No document linked them, no decree acknowledged their similarities. And yet generation after generation, the executioners came to the butcher's court. There's an old proverb from the south of Persia: if you want to end suffering, ask the man who makes food. It speaks to this connection. A clean cut on a goat means less fear, less tension in the meat, less struggle. And to the executioner, this was not just about technique. It was about dignity. The condemned, like the goat, should not die afraid, flailing, or half-finished. That was the unspoken ethic. And so the executioners came, not daily, not publicly, cool, but often enough that the butchers noticed. Some welcomed them, offered tea, demonstrated, with a quiet nod, how they held the blade at a slight angle near the base of the skull, how they waited for the breath to slow before the final cut. Others said nothing. They simply allowed the presence, allowed the watching. One story, buried in the journals of a minor Qajar court clerk, tells of an executioner named Mir Nazar, who apprenticed in the butcher's quarter for 3 months before ever taking up his blade in public. He cut nothing during that time, simply stood beside the butchers each morning, watching the pace of their cuts, the way they spoke softly to the animals, how they never sharpened too close to the blood. And when Mir Nazar finally performed his first public execution, it was said that the blade moved so cleanly, so silently, that not even the condemned had time to react. The scribes recorded it as a stroke in the style of the Lamb Hall. That phrase, style of the Lamb Hall, appears again and again in scattered notes across the period. It did not mean the act was brutish or animalistic. Quite the opposite. It meant the cut was clinical, efficient, without error. There was one crucial difference. Of course, the butcher carved to feed, the executioner to end, but both respected the body. Both sought to make the blade do its work with as little chaos as possible. Even the sharpening tools were similar. Butchers used river-worn stones soaked in brine. So did many executioners. Both professions respected the edge of a tool like it was an extension of their own breath. A poorly sharpened blade was not just a mistake, it was an insult to the animal, to the condemned, to the gods who watched from the air dot, and there were other links in the city of Yazd. It was customary for executioners to purchase their ceremonial blade handles from the same craftsmen who carved the butcher's knives, not for aesthetics, but balance, tease, the way the grip settled in the palm, the curve, the weight. It is also worth noting that both butchers and executioners often worked with their feet bare or in thin sandals, not out of poverty, but sensitivity. They believed the body should feel the moment, not for drama, but connection. It was said that the butcher could feel the readiness of an animal through the stone floor, the executioner through the tremble of the scaffold beneath the condemned. But perhaps the deepest link between them was one of silence. Butchers rarely spoke during the act. Neither did executioners, because when the blade rises and time narrows and the body becomes more breath than thought, words are a disturbance. So now we must ask, in a world where death was delivered by blade, did the cleanest cuts come not from violence, but from the quiet lessons learned over a table meant for meat? Asterisk, his name is not remembered, but his shadow appears twice, once in the record of a butcher's ledger in Shiraz, where payment is listed for a quiet boy with ink on his cuffs, and again in a palace note, where a junior executioner is mentioned only as the one who does not speak. He was never called an apprentice in either place, but he was both in the mornings. He stood behind the slaughter table, holding cloths and bowls of water. In the afternoons, he carried tools to the execution grounds, not the blade itself, never that, but the linen wraps, the sharpening strop, the rinsing bowl, the vinegar-soaked cloths. He was the bridge between two worlds that pretended not to know each other. His days were split down the middle. Goats before noon, men after dot. At the butcher's stall, he learned how to feel along the back of the neck, not for bone, but for calm. Goats, like all animals, have a moment before panic. The butcher taught him how to listen for that silence, not just with the ears, but through the arm that held the body, a loosening, a kind of sigh. And then the cut dot. It was never rushed, never yanked. The blade moved in a single motion, pressed by muscle memory and years of repetition. The apprentice wiped the blade, rinsed it, oiled the hilt, and set it back. He said nothing. That was part of the lesson. At the execution ground, he saw the same thing but wrapped in ceremony. The condemned did not bleat, but they trembled. They did not wear hides, but silks or shackles. Yet the moment before the strike was familiar. A hush in the chest, a kind of release, readiness the body gives up only once. The master executioner, his mentor in this other world, never acknowledged the boy's other role, but he knew. One morning, he held the blade toward the boy, not for sharpening, but for handling. And when the apprentice adjusted the grip, pressing his fingers not on the hilt, but the tang just beneath the guard, the master simply nodded. Only a butcher would hold it like that. Only someone who had felt fat and tendon beneath the steel. Still, the apprentice never asked to strike. That was not his place. His job was to carry and observe. And over time, he became a vessel for two streams of knowledge rarely allowed to meet. The butchers taught him efficiency. The executioners taught him gravity. From one, he learned how to cut without waste. K, from the other, how to kill without spectacle. In between, he took notes, not on paper, too dangerous. He carved marks into the beams of his sleeping quarters, lines, curves, a private code. One mark for every technique learned, another for every mistake he witnessed but could not correct. The most important mark came after a summer morning in Casvin. A merchant had been convicted of treason. His hands were bound, his head bowed. The square was unusually quiet, but the blade did not finish the act in one motion. It struck, then paused. Cot had not been clean. The master executed the second stroke quickly. The air grew tense. The spectators shifted. The guards stepped closer. Afterward, the apprentice was asked to retrieve the blade. He did so, but before he wrapped it, he looked at the edge. It was clean, sharp, maintained. The fault wasn't the blade, it was the angle. That night, back at the butcher's stall, the apprentice asked boldly, perhaps too boldly, what if the angle shifts after the breath? The butcher didn't answer. He simply handed the boy a slab of shoulder meat, told him to strike it, then strike it again, this time from a different angle, then again without shifting his footing, while closing his eyes. By the end, the apprentice's shoulder ached, but he understood something new. Muscle memory wasn't enough. You had to learn to see with your body, to anticipate tension, not just in the neck, but in the breath, the spine, the hips. You had to know when the condemned would move, and you had to move faster from that day forward. The apprentice began using his mornings, not just to clean and carry, but to observe. Bodies in motion, goats, men, women, anyone in the market. He memorized gait, posture, spine alignment, not to judge but to predict. It became an obsession, and it paid off. When the master executioner fell ill in the 3rd month of spring, the court had no time to send for a replacement. They summoned the apprentice. He did not protest. He did not tremble. He washed his hands 3 times, sharpened the blade, unwrapped the cloths, stepped onto the platform barefoot, and when the moment came, he listened, not to the crowd, not to the wind, to the breath. The body across from him gave that same small sigh, that same subtle release. The goat's breath in another form. He cut once, and it was done. That night, he returned to the butcher's quarter, said nothing, but the butcher brought him tea anyway. The apprentice drank in silence. Then he carved a final mark into the beam above his sleeping mat. A curve, not a line, because the lesson wasn't about killing. It was about listening to the moment. The body gives up its struggle, and perhaps that's why, decades later, long after he retired, long after executions became spectacles instead of rituals, people still remembered the boy who had learned from both blood and bread, but they never spoke his name, only said he cut like someone who knew meat, in mercy. So now we must ask, when 2 brutal crafts share one quiet student, which part of him survives the blade, and which part is carved away? Asterisk, it wasn't failure that ended his career. It was perfection. The man once known as the silent apprentice had grown into his role. He no longer fetched plates, no longer waited behind curtains, no longer asked questions. He had become the court's primary executioner. His name appeared very briefly in the books of the Casvin court as he used to the ram, though whether that was a title or his given name is unclear. Easted meant master, but Era meant over the years his reputation spread not for cruelty, not even for speed, but for consistency. He never missed a cut, never needed a second strike, never raised his voice or made a spectacle. His blade didn't sing, it whispered, and in a city that feared chaos more than death, that made him invaluable. But with that silence came something else, unsettling predictability. People People began to notice. The guards, the scribes, the vendors near the square. The scent of blood had lessened. The scaffold remained clean. Some said even the condemned seemed calmer when used to Duram performed the execution. It should have been a triumph, but it wasn't, because the point of public execution was to instill fear, not awe, and certainly not peace. One morning, after an execution of a noble accused of inciting rebellion, the crowd didn't scatter, didn't wail or cross themselves or shout prayers. They simply stood, silence. Some bowed their heads, others whispered, but many just watched, motionless, as Usted Aram wiped his blade with a cloth and descended the steps. And that frightened the court, not because it was a failed execution, but because it was too graceful, too detached, too calm. The Shah's advisor, a man named Farak Bey, sent for Aram that evening. No charges were made. No accusations. It's just a single question. Do you feel anything when you do it? Aram didn't answer right away. He poured a small bowl of tea, placed it on the floor between them, and said, quietly, I feel the same as a butcher does before cutting. Meat for the sick, careful that the meat is clean, so that it may heal, not harm. Farak Bey nodded once, said nothing more. But a week later, a new executioner was appointed, one trained in Tabriz, younger, less experienced, but theatrical, loud, known for brandishing the blade and shouting before the strike. Usted Aram wasn't fired. He simply wasn't summoned again. He didn't protest. He didn't pack. He just stopped appearing at the palace and returned to the butcher's quarter, not to slaughter, but to watch again. The old master was gone. The stalls had new sides. The floors were cleaner, the animals smaller, but the rhythm was the same. The cloths, the strops, slow, measured silence before each cut. It was said that Aram took a corner table at the back of the lane and began sharpening blades not for executioners, but for the butchers themselves. He never asked for coin, only for stories. What did the goat do before the cut? Did its eyes flutter or stay still? Did the skin resist? Did the meat stretch? He took notes again, this time on old scraps of parchment, not court documents, not official ledgers, just thoughts, observations, the tiny human signals that preceded every slice. And slowly, young butchers began to come to him not for lessons in carving, but in feeling. How to prepare the blade, how to listen, how to stop rushing. He taught them the 3 breaths. The first, the animal's panic. The second, the surrender. The third, the void. You cut between the second and third. Never before, never after. It became a saying among apprentices. Wait for the second breath, or let Aram take your blade. He became a kind of myth, not a ghost, but a quiet reminder of what cutting once meant. And then, one morning, the new executioner failed, a public beheading during a festival, meant to remind the people of the court's power, ended in disaster. The blade bounced. A second strike followed, then a third. The crowd panicked. The condemned died, missed a sigh, and by evening, the whispers returned. Where is Aram? But Aram did not return. He refused, because the moment had passed. The court had made its choice, its performance over precision. So Aram lived out his final years among the butchers, not a legend, just a man who sharpened knives and offered tea. Never discussed the executions, never showed his old blade, never told stories, except once, to a boy maybe 10 or 11 who had cut his hand helping his father clean a lamb. Aram bandaged the boy's fingers, quietly, carefully, and the boy asked, "Did you ever cut someone who didn't cry?" Aram looked at him, placed a hand on the boy's head, and said, "The cleanest cut is the one where the body says thank you." The boy didn't understand. Not yet, but years later. He carved that sentence into the doorframe of his butcher stall. It faded over time, but the shape of the words remained, because, in the end, what Aram understood, what the court never did, was that technique is not cruelty, that silence is not weakness, and that a man who learns from both death and food will never raise a blade without cause. So, we ask now, in a world that no longer listens to silence, what was lost? The executioner chose to walk away from the scaffold and return to the table where meat was prepared with care. There was a room in the palace compound that no one ever pointed out. It had no sign above its arch, no guards posted outside, no ink lines on the court architect's scroll, and yet everyone who worked in the palace knew it existed. It was not large. It had no windows, and it always smelled faintly of sandalwood and iron. This was the blade room, not where weapons were stored, not where they were forged, but where they were refined, slowly, carefully, repeatedly, by the quiet hands of men who did not wear robes of honor or sit at the royal council table. The sandalwood room, as it came to be known in whispers, was the final stop between preparation and death. Executioners came here before every major event, not just to sharpen their blades, but to listen to them. Yes, listen, because Persian blades, especially those forged for ceremonial or judicial executions, were not just hunks of steel. They were shaped, tuned, and balanced like instruments, and those who honed them knew the subtle hum that passed through the handle. When the edge was drawn across the air, the sandalwood room was never loud. The walls were lined with felt. The floor was bare cedar, smoothed to near silence underfoot. The only furniture was a single wooden bench, a tray of stones, and a tall lamp with a flickering flame, shielded in glass. But the most important object in the room was unseen, the scent bowl, placed beneath the bench. The bowl was filled each morning with a mixture of sandalwood chips, crushed rose stem, and a trace of poppy ash. As the lamp warmed the room, the heat released a steady, soft aroma, overwhelming but unmistakable. This scent was part of the sharpening process. It wasn't about luxury, it was about focus. The blend dulled distractions, settled the nerves, kept the breath steady. Executioners, it was said, could tell the moment the scent changed when the poppy ash began to dominate the sandalwood. That's when the blade had to be tested. Sharpening was done slowly, not with pressure, but with weight. The blade was passed along a whetstone, moistened with rice water, not oil, because rice water didn't leave a residue. It's then drawn once across a leather strap infused with myrtle wax soft, pliant, and forgiving. But before any sharpening began, there was a ritual. The executioner would enter barefoot. He would bow not deeply, but once he had sit on the bench, he would unroll his blade, unwrap the cloth, and place it flat on the bench before him. Then, for a full minute, he did nothing. This minute was sacred. No sharpening, no examining, just breath, just presence. Some believed the blade absorbed the mood of the handler. Others believed it simply needed to be remembered, that the steel had to recognize the hand that would carry it. And perhaps that's why the sandalwood room was always so still. It was not a place for talking. It was a place for preparing something that must not fail, because failure with the blade meant two things: cruelty for the condemned and shame for the court. There is an old saying from the mid-Qayyar period: the Shah's mercy is measured in the sharpness of his servant's blade. That mercy began here. Sharpeners, not executioners, ran the room. They were not men of blood. They were craftsmen. Some had once been armorers. Others were former blacksmiths. A few were scholars of metallurgy, but all shared one thing. They believed a blade was not finished when it left a forge, only began to become itself. These men never asked who the blade would be used on. They didn't care. They asked only, what kind of cut is needed? Will it pass through hair? Will it stop at bone or travel through? They adjusted the sharpening accordingly. There were blades meant for high officials, those required a longer taper, slightly convex edge. There were blades for traders, often duller, intentionally brutal. There were blades for women, which were shorter, curved more deeply, and required a finer edge. The act was done in seclusion, often in smaller courtyards. And then there were the royal blades. These were wrapped in silk, carried by apprentices with hands bound in linen. They were not to be touched by anyone without rank. In one court document from the 1820s, there is a note. The blade of the Prince's Justice arrived at dawn. The scent bowl had been refreshed. The edge required 6 passes. No more. The balance. Why? No record says. Perhaps a new architect forgot to include it in a renovation. Perhaps a change in court taste made sandalwood old-fashioned. Or perhaps the new generation of officials cared more for speed than silence. What we do know is this: the last entry in the blade register written in careful ink reads, sharpened in open court. Wind, disturbed final edge, returned unsatisfactory. After that, the sandalwood room was mentioned no more, and slowly the blades began to lose something, not their sharpness, but their peace. So now we ask, if a blade is honed without silence, without scent, without pause, does it still remember mercy, or does it forget and cut as the world now demands with speed, but without care? Asterisk, the man they called Caliph, the nose, never touched a blade in his life. He was not a smith, not an executioner, not even an apprentice. And yet, for nearly 20 years, no blade left the sandalwood room without passing under his nose. He was not born to the trade. In fact, Caliph began as a perfumer's assistant in the Shiraz bazaar. He measured sandalwood powder, sealed jars of ambergris, cut rose petals, and dried them in clay ovens. But over time, he noticed something odd when he prepared a vial of attar oil. He could predict by smell alone how long it would last, how the scent would decay on skin, whether it would fade into sourness or dry into sweetness. The perfumer noticed too, called it instinct, called it talent. But Caliph disagreed. It's not instinct, he said once. It's memory. That's what made Caliph different. He remembered scents, not just notes, but changes. He could smell the moment sandalwood turned bitter from sun exposure. The instant vinegar turned from cleansing to sour. He claimed, half-jokingly, that he could smell dishonesty on a man's sleeve. One day, a court official came to the perfumer's stall looking for a scent to mask the blade room's sharpening smoke. The usual oils weren't working. The heat from the flame had changed the behavior of the room. Scents were reacting strangely. The official, desperate, handed Caliph a half-charred cloth used in the sharpening bench and asked, "Can you fix this?" Caliph didn't answer. He sniffed it, turned it in his hand, sniffed again. "This scent doesn't need masking," he said at last. "It needs permission." The official, confused, asked what he meant. "It's being smothered," Caliph said. "Too much wax in the myrtle oil. It's blocking the steel." The official left, but returned 2 days later with an invitation. "Come to the sandalwood room, adjust the scent. If you succeed, you may stay." And so, Caliph entered the room for the first time. He did not bow. That wasn't his way. But he sat on the floor beside the scent bowl and, for over an hour, said nothing. He listened to the room. He breathed. He held his hand over the lamp. Then he asked for poppy ash and crushed fig bark. The next morning, when the blade was sharpened, the steel gave a different ring. Sharper, lighter. The edge was finer than expected. From that day forward, Caliph became part of the ritual. He did not sharpen. He did not touch the blade. He simply smelled it after each session. If the scent around the blade was wrong to sour, too sharp, too flat, he would say, "Sharpen again." No one argued, because Caliph's nose was never wrong. One master executioner even claimed that Caliph saved his career. He had felt confident in a blade's readiness edge. Perfect, balance, smooth. But Caliph stopped him at the door. "It smells cold," he said. "Cold? The blade doesn't trust you today." The executioner hesitated, resharpened, adjusted his grip. On the second pass, the scent shifted. Caliph nodded, and that morning's execution was flawless. Eventually, a myth grew around Caliph's gift. Some said he had once lost a brother to a dull blade and vowed never to let it happen again. Others said he had no sense of sight and lived entirely by smell. Neither was true. He simply paid more attention than most ever thought to. But his role began to fade with time. New court officials questioned his usefulness. Steel, they argued, was about angles, not aromas. Scent couldn't dull a blade. Smell couldn't measure edge sharpness. They called him a luxury. And luxuries, they said, were not needed anymore. Caliph left quietly. He packed his scent bowls, closed the oil jars, took a last breath of the sandalwood air, and walked out. Within 6 months, the blades began to miss. Not every time, but enough. The sharpening was rushed. The leather strops were poorly cured. The rice water was diluted, but the executioners, who had once trained in silence, were now told to prioritize timing over tension, appearances over atmosphere, and the scent. No one noticed it was gone, except the crowd. A few observers wrote that the square smelled different, not worse, just louder. The blood seemed sharper. The iron clung to their clothes longer. No one could say why. They didn't know that the man who used to balance the air had been dismissed. Years later, one of Caliph's old students found him in the outskirts of Yazd, selling vinegar-soaked cloths to farmers for preserving cheese. The student asked, "Do you miss the blade room?" Caliph laughed, but softly. "I miss the silence between the blade and the breath." The student paused. "And the smell?" Caliph's eyes narrowed, amused. The steel never had a smell, only the silence around it did. There are no records of Caliph's death, no grave, no eulogy, but in the corner of the old blade room, long after it was abandoned, someone found a small clay bowl buried under the bench. Inside was a powder, aged and faded, that still carried the trace of SANDALWOOD dot, and next to it, K. On the floorboards were 3 faint words scratched in Farsi. "Let the steel breathe." So we must ask, when steel forgets how to breathe, when the silence is replaced by noise, the scent by smoke, does the blade remain just as sharp, or does something vital, invisible, inhuman, quietly vanish? Asterisk. It was just before the monsoons when the blade came back, not because it was broken, not because it had failed, okay, but because it had refused. That's how the story was told, anyway. Whispered through the quarters of the palace in Isfahan, passed from guards to scribes to kitchen boys. The blade struck, but it did not cut. The condemned was a poet, not a noble, not a rebel, a man who had written something unflattering about the governor's brother. He was sentenced swiftly, quietly, without the usual public announcements. The execution was to be small, private, witnessed only by 3 officials, 1 soldier, and the court scribe. The executioner was experienced. The blade had been prepared in the sandalwood room, still functioning then, though barely maintained. The scent bowl had not been changed in days. The edge had passed inspection. It was the same blade that had ended the lives of thieves, traitors, and even a vizier. But this time, when the blade descended, the air changed. It didn't ring. It didn't whistle. It thudded, a dull, confused sound, and the poet's head remained attached. There was a pause. The officials thought it was a mistake, bad angle, poor posture, a miscalculation. But the executioner, who had never missed, knew better. He rechecked the edge. It was still sharp. He adjusted his grip, tried again. The second strike landed harder. Still, no clean cut, only a gash, the kind that bleeds without releasing, the kind that makes everyone wish they'd looked away. It took a third stroke to finish it, but by then, the silence had turned sour. The blade was returned in shame, but not blamed. The executioner was questioned, the platform inspected, the cloths checked. All were fine, but the blade so carefully sharpened in the sandalwood room was said to feel wrong. It was placed on the workbench, left untouched for 3 days. Then something odd happened. The sharpener who came to clean and inspect the blade refused to touch it. He claimed the metal smelled burnt, not with fire, but with failure. He said the scent bowl, which had gone unchanged, had turned bitter. The wax had soured. The sandalwood had blackened at the edges. Something was off. More sharpeners were summoned. One said the blade's edge resisted the stone. Another said it vibrated strangely when stroked. No one could explain it, and so the blade was wrapped in cloth and set aside, retired, but not discarded. In later years, when the sandalwood room fell into disuse, the blade remained there on the highest shelf, wrapped in 6 layers of linen, each one bearing a small inked mark. It became a kind of quiet legend, not because it failed, but because it had once worked so perfectly, and then stopped. The scholar, then he whispered a prayer, not to the gods, not to the Shah, but to the blade itself. He said, "You served cleanly, you served quietly, you do not need to serve again." And with that, he sealed the blade in an oiled case, locked it, buried it beneath the floorboards of the room. The scent bowl was emptied, the lamp extinguished, the door closed for the final time. The sandalwood room was never used again. Years later, a new executioner trained in the modern fashion, with steel imported from Europe, stood on the same platform where the poet had died. His blade shone brighter. His hands moved faster. The scent of sandalwood was long gone. But someone in the crowd, an old guard, perhaps swore that just before the blade struck, he smelled something faint. Not blood, not vinegar, sandlwood, only for a moment. Then it vanished. And so we wonder, can a room carry memory? Can steel remember silence? Can a blade, made for clean death, choose not to cut, not out of dullness, but out of dignity? And if it can, what else have we forgotten to listen to? Asterisk, in the outskirts of Kashan, not far from the riverbed, where water trickled even in the dry months, there stood a small stone building with no sign and only one door. It wasn't a mosque, it wasn't a bathhouse, and it certainly wasn't a prison. Every morning, just before dawn, a man would enter that building carrying only a folded linen cloth, a copper bowl, and a silence as heavy as the blade he would later carry. He was the executioner, and he was going to bathe, not once, but twice. It wasn't about hygiene, not entirely. It was about something older, stranger, more rooted in ritual than reason, because in Persian tradition, particularly during the Safavid and early Qajar periods, the act of state execution was more than a punishment. It was a passage, a severing, not just of flesh, but of spirit, of order, of the invisible fabric that held the community together. And the man who did the cutting had to be made neutral, clean, unaligned, a vessel emptied of his own will. That's why he bathed. The first bath was taken in silence, without soap. Just water drawn from a cold cistern and poured slowly over the head, shoulders, arms, and feet. This water was known as VB, soaked the water of silence. It was meant to strip away distraction, not dirt, but thought. The executioner would kneel on the stone, naked, but for a cloth around his waist, and pour the water with steady rhythm. 3 ladles over the head, one for each shoulder, one over each foot, and then a final ladle directly onto the chest. No one else was allowed in the building during this time. Even his apprentice waited outside, eyes downcast, listening to the echo of water against stone. When the last ladle fell, the executioner remained kneeling. He didn't dry off. He didn't speak. He simply waited for the sound of the water to still. Then he stood and dried his body with a coarse wool cloth, never cotton, which was thought too soft for the seriousness of the act ahead. He then sat on a low stool in the corner, facing the eastern wall, and waited. Not for an order, not for a signal, but for the right breath. The one that came after silence had fully settled into his chest. That breath told him he was ready to move to the next phase. Only then did he call for the apprentice. The apprentice entered, carrying a second bowl. This one filled not with plain water, but with infused water steeped with dried quince skin, marjoram, and vinegar. This was the second bath. The VB cast the water of intention. Here, the executioner would scrub, carefully, slowly, hands first, then the feet, then the arms. He didn't wash the face, not yet. That would come last, just before the blade was drawn later in the day. The idea was simple, but powerful. The first bath erased distraction. The second aligned action. He was no longer just a man, was now a tool sharpened, prepared, and purified. Some bath records survive from the Kashan court archives. Most are brief, simple notes by scribes and attendants. Used to Jahan entered for morning silence. No speech. Second water prepared with vinegar and quince as instructed. No change in color. Hands soaked longer today. Possible. Heaviness of mind. These weren't just observations. They were readings the way a master might read a blade for balance, or a physician might read a pulse. The body of the executioner had to show readiness. If it did not, the execution could be delayed. Not for mercy, but to avoid disorder. There's one peculiar case from 1813. The executioner, respected man named Merdad, took his first bath as usual, but during the second, the vinegar water refused to settle. The surface kept bubbling slightly, as if disturbed by air. The apprentice tried again. Same result. The elders were called. They checked the water source. Nothing wrong. They checked the bowl. Perfectly sealed. They looked at Merdad, who had not spoken a word, and then, quietly, the senior scribe said, "He carries doubt today. The water is telling us the execution was postponed." 3 days later, my dad returned. This time, the water lay still. No bubbling, no hesitation. The execution proceeded. It was said that the man executed had once been Merdad's schoolmate, but no one dared ask. This story was told for years, not because of the delay, but because of what it confirmed, that the bath wasn't superstition. It was a barometer of the soul. The bathhouse itself was kept minimal. No ornate tiles, no mirrors, just smooth stone, carefully swept. The scent of the room changed daily based on the ingredients in the second bowl. On some days, it was floral rose, stem, and fig leaf. On others, medicinal sage and ash bark. But the most sacred scent was the vinegar quince mix. It was said to open the chest, to align breath and bone. The guards respected it. They walked slowly near the bathhouse. Even the palace dogs avoided its threshold. No jokes were told within earshot. Even the prince, when he once passed by during the morning rite, removed his shoes because everyone knew this was not a place of washing. It was a place of shedding the man, becoming the blade dot. So now we must ask, in a world that treats cleanliness as surface, what would it mean to wash not just the body, but the will? And what happens to a man when he learns how to disappear himself before sunrise? Asterisk between the first bath and the second. There was a pause. Not long, perhaps 20 or 30 minutes, but it was the most critical interval in the entire morning. This was the time when the executioner reassembled himself, not as a person, but as a function, a presence, a form of balance in a world teetering on disorder. He would not speak. He would not eat. He would not sharpen. He would sit, breathe, and wait for his skin to dry on its own. The drying mattered. Towels could rush it. Cloth could interfere. But air, that slow, silent drying, was nature's way of sealing the first bath's effect. It allowed the silence of VBE socked to sink fully into the pores, into the folds of the elbow, behind the knees, across the back of the neck. And this time, the apprentice performed his own quiet duties. He swept the stone floor, checked the scent bowl, adjusted the flame of the corner lamp so the room remained warm but not stifling. He refilled the copper vessel with a second water, stirring gently to keep the quince rind suspended and the vinegar balanced. If the ratio was off, the mix was too sharp or too bland, could disrupt the ritual. That's what happened. In Mashahad, one spring, according to a merchant's journal, an apprentice, unfamiliar with the properties of dried quince, used slices instead of skins. The water turned syrupy, sweet. The executioner's arms became sticky. He couldn't perform the scrubbing motions properly. The bath had to be abandoned, the water discarded. The apprentice was dismissed, because this moment between the baths wasn't just an idle pause. It was when the mind recalibrated. One executioner described it like this: the first bath removes my story. The second gives me the shahs. In that space in between, he is no longer Marin, the son of a gardener, or Azim, who once loved a woman who moved to Hamadan. He becomes what the state needs him to be, a clean, unshaped hand, and in this vulnerable state bare, silent. Still, there was often a memory that surfaced. Every executioner had one: a child's face, a father's voice, cry from the butcher's stall in youth. These were not distractions. They were check-ins. If the memory sparked rage or sorrow, the second bath would wait. The mind wasn't ready. But if the memory passed like smoke, acknowledged and dissolved, then the water could continue its work. Asterisk, it was a way of asking, are you empty yet? Only when the answer was yes could the ritual proceed. The second bath was not about the external body. That was already washed. This bath was about alignment. Each motion had to correspond with a principle. Scrubbing the hands meant clarity of intent. Rinsing the arms meant strength without cruelty. Washing the feet meant presence awareness of the ground beneath the act. The final motion, this last act, was not done in the bathhouse itself. It was reserved for just before stepping toward the place of judgment. A small splash from the leftover infused water was poured into the palm and drawn gently across the brow, then cheek-studded. Was called the last forgetting. The point was not to forget. Though condemned, it was to forget oneself. One court document from the reign of Fathali. Shah notes, executioner Zahir observed full rights. Both waters accepted. Final motion steady. No visible trembling. Scent of quince intact. These entries seem minor, but they were closely reviewed. When execution went poorly, a second strike was required. If the condemned spoke too long, if the crowd murmured, officials checked the bathhouse log first, because they knew a missed ritual was often a source of a failed blade. Even the guards respected this. If an executioner was late, he wasn't scolded. He was asked, did the water accept you today? And he would answer with honesty, always, because to lie in the bathhouse was to invite misfortune at the scaffold. There's a lesser-known story from a coastal village near Bandar Abbas. The executioner there skipped the first bath one morning due to storming rain and poor roads. He performed only the second. That day, his blade slipped. The wound bled slowly. The condemned cried out, not from fear, but from surprise. He hadn't expected to feel anything. The crowd panicked. The sentence had to be delayed. The executioner returned home and refused to take the blade again for 3 years. He told his apprentice, the first water wasn't just habit, it was permission. By the late 1800s, many of these practices began to fade. New officials considered the baths wasteful, too spiritual, slow. Executioners were told to clean themselves quickly, efficiently, using soap and towels. No quince, no marjoram, no waiting between breaths. And with that, the the two-bath ritual disappeared. Only one fragment remains, etched into a stone basin once used in the Kashan bathhouse, now kept in a dusty corner of a museum. Are the words, "Cut not with the hand that remembers itself." So now we ask, if death is an act, what must a man erase from himself before performing it? And when those old washings vanish, what stains do we carry into the act we once thought clean? Asterisk, it began with a renovation. A new administrator had been appointed to the provincial court of Kashan, young, sharp-featured, and trained in the French style of governance. He had traveled through Istanbul, studied with British clerks, and had no patience for what he called rituals that waste time. His first orders were simple: relocate palace space, consolidate records, reduce redundancies, and then one morning, with no warning, he gave an instruction that would end a 100-year tradition. Turn the bathhouse into storage. The basin was to be drained, the scent bowls discarded, the copper vessels sold or repurposed. When the guards hesitated, knowing what the building truly meant, he clarified with a single sentence: the law needs no perfume. And just like that, the two-bath ritual was gone at first. The executioners said nothing. They bathed at home, quietly, in their own courtyards. They asked their apprentices to heat the water, crush the quince peel, find vinegar that wasn't too sharp. They tried to keep the rhythm intact, but something felt different. The floor was too rough. The wind interfered. The neighbors coughed. The scent never lingered long enough to settle the breath. One executioner, an elder named David, tried to recreate the original space behind his own home. He built a stone bench, lit a single oil lamp, burned myrtle and dried marjoram. But even he admitted, the water hears too many voices here, because it was never about the water alone. It was about the place where the body remembered what it had to become, where the scent met the skin without interruption, where the air between the two baths was quiet enough to erase selfhood without the room. The transition frayed, and the effects was seen almost immediately. Records from 1891 to 1894 show an increase in failed executions, blades slipping, condemned individuals flinching, even crowds becoming restless. Guards wrote terse notes. Delay due to uncertainty. Executioner appeared nervous. Second strike required. None of these notes ever blamed the bathhouse, but the old scribes knew. One anonymous margin note on a torn page reads simply, "There is vinegar, but no silence." The executioners began to change, too. They spoke more, hesitated more. Some took to drinking the night before, Others practiced alone in courtyards, trying to rebuild muscle memory. And no repetition could replace what the baths had provided. Without the first bath, the mind cluttered. Without the second, the body clenched. And soon, a new kind of executioner emerged, trained fast, armed well, dressed for ceremony, but not for transformation. These new men saw the act as profession, not passage. They sharpened blades in open courtyards, smoked opium before sunrise, carried themselves like soldiers, not priests. One older apprentice wrote, "My new master does not bathe. He washes only his hands. He says it is enough to be clean by law. But I have seen the sweat on his brow. I have seen him bite his lip when the crowd murmurs. He is sharp, but not steady. And perhaps that's the difference. The two-bath ritual did not make a man pure. It made him still. It gave him time just enough to shed his name, his grief, his fear. It's not to destroy those things, but to set them aside. And when the baths were taken away, the blade no longer swung from emptiness. It swung from pride, from nerves, from haste. Even the condemned began to notice. There are poems quiet, almost forgotten, written by those awaiting execution in the late KR years. One includes the line, "I saw his hand shake before he took the sword. I feared not death, but error," 'cause the rituals weren't just for the executioner. They were for everyone watching. Everyone breathing that air thought the water's rhythm reassured them that justice was not vengeance, that death, though final, could be clean in the end. The old bathhouse was converted into a storeroom for grain, then into a small barracks, then into nothing. Today, stones are part of a wall near a parking lot. The scent bowl was sold to a merchant who used it to store spices. The basin, cracked, became a trough for animals. The door was burned for firewood during a harsh winter, and yet, every now and then, the local whispers that on certain early mornings, when the wind is low and the air hangs heavy, the stone near that wall smells faintly of quince and vinegar, only for a moment, then it fades. But it is enough to remember what was lost. So now we must ask, when the rituals of stillness are stripped away, when haste replaces rhythm and form replaces transformation, what is it exactly that the blade begins to cut? Flesh, or something far more fragile? Asterisk, before the shadow of the gallows touched the square into breeze each morning, the fruit sellers were already there. Not the executioners, not the guards, not the condemned, just the vendors, dictates, laying out figs on woven mats, fanning flies away from piles of grapes, stacking pomegranates 2 rows high beside crates of bitter oranges. To the outsider, it must have seemed strange, a contradiction. Why would a city place its gallows at site of final judgment next to its food? But to those who lived in the cities of Safavid and Kayar, Persia, it wasn't strange at all. It was routine, practical, even comforting, because in the Persian world, punishment was never removed from daily life. Ali sat beside it. Ali bled into it. And the square maiden was a space where bread and death mingled without contradiction. The Tabriz Square was typical in design. On one side, the administrative court. Opposite that, the mosque. On the third, the gallows, a tall wooden beam with 2 posts, often disguised beneath a canopy when not in use. Opposite the gallows, the stalls, fruit, bread, sweets, tools, life, and yet, each morning, as vendors unpacked apricots and melon rinds, they glanced always once toward the scaffold to check, to see if a rope had been hung, if a platform had been dusted, if guards loitered. Because, why? Because for many, execution was not a spectacle. It was a punctuation mark in the sentence of the day. It reminded them not violently, but rhythmically, that law had a shape, that order required reminders, and that life, to continue, must carry on beside death. There's a traveler's account from a Russian emissary in 1794. He writes, "I purchased honeyed almonds while the crowd quieted for a man's hanging. The vendor, a short man with a mole beneath his left eye, handed me the packet and said, 'Chew slowly. The air will taste bitter after the drop.' Then he turned and watched. We all did. And afterward, he offered dried cherries for half price. This may sound cold, but it wasn't apathy. It was integration. Persian city design did not separate civic life from justice. The scaffold was not exiled to the edge of town. It stood at the center, reminded the bread sellers that their scales must be honest. It reminded the cobblers to measure both shoes evenly. It reminded children that whispers have weight. And yet, curiously, it also protected the condemned, because when death occurs beside a fruit stall, beside a child eating rice from a paper cone, beside a mother haggling over quince past it, cannot become pure spectacle. It remains tethered to life. The executioner, aware of this, often moved with extra care. He knew that the blade's arc would be remembered by the butcher, that the sound would echo into the tea vendor's sleeves, that if the death was messy, the air would grow tight. The fruit would be ignored, and the market would suffer. So he performed with dignity, precision, because his act had witnesses who were not there. Q. Watch him. There's a curious line from a local poem rarely cited. He died beside oranges. The smell was sweet. The lesson was clear. What was the lesson? That death is not far. That law sits beside lemon rind. That the executioner is not outside of the market, but part of its rhythm. And that's why, perhaps, the stalls remained, not for convenience, not for profit, but because they reminded everyone, including the condemned, that life does not wait. And so we ask, when a noose sways above baskets of apricots, when the bread rises as a man's breath stops, when fruit is sold beneath a beam once meant for fear, what kind of society does that shape? One that celebrates death, or one that dares to keep living beside it? Asterisk, the fruit sellers weren't just merchants. They were witnesses, not official, not sworn, not documented, but vital, because they watched what others ignored. They saw who tied the rope, who trembled, who lingered, and they noticed the difference between justice and something that only looked like it. Each vendor had their own way of measuring the weight of a moment. Not in grams or diners, but in eyes. There was an old man named Ahmed who sold dried mulberries under a crooked blue canopy. He'd been in that square for 43 years, never moved stalls, never changed the size of his scales. He claimed he could tell what kind of day it would be by the way the wind moved through the gallows beam at sunrise. The rope turns. Once, he told a traveler, the death will be fast. If it swings twice, someone's not ready. If it's still, then the city is holding its breath. Dobton, he was right. But Ahmed didn't say these things aloud unless he trusted you. He whispered them, folding mulberries into a cone of old newspaper. His stall sat directly across from the scaffold. Not the closest, but not far. Close enough to see the blade when it gleamed. Far enough not to hear the last words. He said that was deliberate. I want to see, he once said, but I don't want to remember voices. Faces fade, words stay. Other vendors had their own rituals. A woman named Perry, who sold warm bread filled with dates and anise, would place a single red thread in her stall's corner whenever a hanging was scheduled. She wouldn't speak it. She wouldn't warn her customers, but those whom you really knew would see it and lower their voices. The thread meant, this is a day when mercy didn't arrive. On those days, she baked smaller loaves. The crowds would come early. People shopped quickly. Coins passed with less conversation. Eyes flicked toward the scaffold. Everyone waited for the sound, the shift in the crowd's breath that signaled the moment had passed. And when it did, Square returned to itself, almost because every execution left behind a residue, not always visible, not always spoken, but the vendors felt it in the weight of the scales. Bread rose too fast. Fruit softened before noon. Sugar turned bitter in the air. Ahmed swore that his dates fermented faster after a second strike. God, that their skins cracked sooner. God, as if the blade itself had split the day, and time was leaking through the wound. This was not superstition. This was market wisdom, because the vendors, more than the guards, more than the scribes, knew what death did to the air, and they adjusted, not out of fear or responsibility. One baker always set out a small bowl of water and rose petals beside his cart after a hanging. When asked why, he said, so the bread doesn't harden with sorrow. And people believed him, not because the petals changed the flour. Tea but because they acknowledge the unspoken truth that death has weight, and that if you do not mark it, however small, however gently, it sinks into the loaves. It bruises the fruit. It lingers on the fingers of the children who come to buy sugared figs. There's a record. It's just a scribbled note on the back of a bread merchant supply order that says, 3 ropes this week. Pastry turned hollow. Adjust heat. Add honey. Not clear whether this was practical advice or poetry. In the market square, the two often blurred, because in a place where law was displayed, not hidden, where death stood beside melon rinds and almond flour, you learned to balance more than just coins. You balanced grief. You weighed the edge of a day. You learned the difference between punishment and loss. So now we must ask, when a market adapts to justice, when vendors learn to measure the invisible, what truths do they preserve quietly in figs and flatbread when no one else is looking? Asterisk. It had happened before. Executions that didn't go cleanly. Knots that failed. Blades that bounced. Crowds that flinched instead of falling silent. But never like this. It was late autumn in Yazd. The winds had begun to turn. Dust clung to every crack in the brickwork. Traders wore wool early, before the frost had even reached the orchard walls. The square was crowded that morning more than usual. Not because people wanted to witness death, but because they were waiting for the wrong one. Rumor had spread quickly, quietly, that a boy would be executed. 15, maybe 16, accused of stealing from a caravan official. Not bread, not coin, but a dagger. A decorative one, meant for display. Theft, nonetheless. And treason, they said. The ruling came down without appeal. Execution by hanging at dawn, in full view of the market. The night before, something shifted. Vendors packed up early, covered their stalls more tightly. Bread wasn't sold past sunset. Fruit was not left in baskets overnight. No one shouted about dates or walnuts. They nodded to each other more, said less, and in the dark, 3 vendors, the mulberry man, the bread seller, and the spice woman, who always placed mint in her corner, met at the edge of the square. They did not speak of protest. That word didn't fit the time. Spoke of absence. The next morning, their stalls were gone. Not moved, not looted, not there. And others noticed, by the hour of the call to prayer, the eastern edge of the square, usually thick with smells of cardamom and stewed apples, was quiet. Kalos stood alone. No scent of warm bread. No sugar-dusted cakes. Cavy, no familiar fruit. When the executioner arrived, barefoot as always, he paused, not at the scaffold, at the empty road stalls. He said nothing. The crowd gathered tighter this time, unsure where to stand. The guards whispered. The apprentice watched the space beside the scaffold, confused. Oh, vendors, oh, balance. The boy was brought forward. He was thin.com. His eyes were wide, but not pleading. He looked not at the crowd, but at the missing stalls. He noticed, and then something happened that no one could account for. The rope snapped, not immediately. It held for a second, 2, then whipped like a severed reed, and fell. The crowd gasped. The boy fell forward, stunned but alive. The guards rushed. The rope was collected, retied, asterisk, but the moment was broken. The crowd shifted. Eyes wandered. Someone called out, not loudly, not with rage, just with a tired voice. The market won't eat after this. That phrase stuck. The execution continued, but the silence was different now. Afterward, the stalls did not return. Not that day. Not that week. For 6 days, the vendors left the eastern edge of the square untouched. Customers begged. Officials barked, but the fruit stayed in cellars. The bread stayed warm in homes, unsold. The spices remained in jars, and slowly the gallows began to feel out of place. Not illegal, not dismantled, just coon, because the square required rhythm, life, exchange, and without the market, quo, the scaffold was only a threat. There's a note in the governor's diary, brief and unassuming. Stalls absent, crowd thin, merchant spirits low. Executioner asked to return blade to court. The boy's death was never overturned, but the scaffold was moved to the rear courtyard of the court complex, out of view. The vendors returned, not triumphant, not defiant, just present again, with fruit arranged in tighter pyramids, bread folded more carefully, herbs tied with red twine, a reminder of the rope that had once fallen. They never spoke of those days directly, but if you asked for mulberries, near the scaffold wall, Ahmed would say, "We don't sell grief anymore," and maybe that was their protest, not loud, not written, but felt, in the empty space where the scent of bread had once softened the edge of justice. So, now we ask, what happens when those who feed the world refuse to feed the rituals of power? What does the city taste like when the market turns its back on the gallows? Asterisk in the courts of Safavid in early Qajar, Persia. The blade never swung on just any day. It was not enough for a sentence to be passed, not enough for a scaffold to be built, not enough for guilt to be certain and the crowd to be ready. The sky had to agree, because in Persia, time itself had laws written not only by men but by stars, by seasons, by sacred days etched into the old lunar and solar calendars. And the executioner, he did not serve just the court, he served the calendar. The Persian calendar was layered. One layer followed the solar year divided into seasons, months, festivals. Another followed the Islamic lunar months, marking holy days, fasts, and days when blood could not be spilled. A third, less known, was astrological, kept by the court astronomers who marked open and closed windows for state actions. These calendars did not always agree, and when they conflicted, the execution was delayed, not out of mercy, but precision. There's a record from the year 1785 in Isfahan. A man sentenced for embezzlement was scheduled for execution on a Thursday morning, but the court astronomer objected. "The moon wanes in the sixth house," he wrote, "and Saturn casts a crooked shadow on the day of Taurus. If blood is spilled now, it will return to the palace." The judge postponed the sentence 3 days. No explanation to the public, just silence. When the execution finally took place on a Sunday, the wind was calm, the crowd quiet. The blade fell once, no omens reported. This was not superstition. Not in the eyes of the court. It was alignment, because time in Persia was not neutral. It had texture. Some days were soft, prat. Some days were brittle, and some, like the 10th of Muharram, or Nowruz, or certain nights of the new moon, were sealed. On these days, even the executioner would not unsheath his blade. He might eat, he might pray, but he would not work. It is said that on the night of Shabiada, the longest night of the year, the apprentice would remove the blade from the sharpening bench and bury it under warm cloth, wrapped in dried rose petals, not to protect it, to let it sleep, because Shabiada was a night of storytelling, of poetry, of remembering light in darkness, a night for pomegranates. Not punishment. To cut on that night was to sever something deeper than flesh, even outside of religion. Certain days were avoided. The first Friday of any month, the 7th day after a solar eclipse, the day after a Kwai royal wedding, the first and last snow of the year. These dates were considered fragile, not because the condemned might be innocent, but because the city itself wasn't ready to witness death. And so the executioner waited, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. In one case, a political prisoner sat bound for nearly 40 days because the palace calendar keeper could not find an auspicious morning after the alignment of Jupiter and the spring equinox. The guards rotated shifts. The prisoner was fed, but no one touched the blade. There was logic in this. Cold logic, perhaps, but logic nonetheless. The court believed that blood spilled on the wrong day would stain not just the scaffold, but the fabric of the ruler's luck. That misaligned death would echo through taxes, through sickness, through war. To kill cleanly was to kill in rhythm, and for this, the calendar readers were just as important as the judges. They wore no robes of justice. They carried no blades. Their fingers hovered over scrolls, ink, and stars. They kept time and thus controlled death. One executioner, in a rare moment of dictation, reportedly said, "I do not cut with my hands. I cut with their hours." So we must ask, if a blade waits for the stars to align, if death is timed like harvest, like rain, like prayer, then who truly commands justice? The hand that holds the sword, or the sky that says, "Not yet"? Asterisk, his name was Barrows Lkshi. Not a famous figure, not a warrior or poet or vizier, but every governor in the western provinces knew. If Barrows said, "Not today," the blade was lowered. He wasn't loud. He wasn't political. He rarely left the observatory tower in the Shah's second palace near Kermanshah, but in a world where justice could be final with a single gesture, he used to pause the breath between condemnation and conclusion, because Barrows read the heavens. And in Persia, the heavens had their own opinion about death. He wasn't a mystic act. He kept no amulets. He wore simple wool robes, the same ink-stained pair, summer and winter. He kept time by candle drip and sand glass, but his calculations, meticulously drawn, unlayered, toasting, parchment scrolls, governed when the court could act. The executioners didn't like him. Toast, the watcher of nooses, not because he interfered, but because his silence had weight. He never spoke in the main court. He whispered, hand only to the Grand Vizier or the Chief Judge. A nod, a date scribbled on paper, a slow shake of the head when the moon turned her back. It was said that he could feel the misalignment of days in his bones. And then came the year 1808. The governor of Loristan had uncovered a plot trio, or imagined a group of traitors, perhaps, involved in smuggling or currency deceit. 12 men were arrested. Their trial was swift, their sentence immediate. Public execution, one after the other. The scaffold was prepared, ropes tested, scribes summoned, vendors informed. The square measured for crowd control, but the executioner experienced. Man named Rashid hesitated, not because of nerves, not because of pity, but because it was the 5th day of the 5th month, and that, according to his own father's notes, was a closed day, a time when Saturn's gaze was considered malignant. Rashid had never executed on a 5th. His mentor had warned him. Old scrolls, inherited from masters past, noted accidents and failed strikes. Rashid told the guards. The guards told the judge. The judge, sit for Behrouz, in Barrows, came not in protest, not in defiance, but with a thin scroll under his arm. He entered the courtyard, did not remove his shoes, simply pointed at the parchment. The ink was red, the drawing simple, a 7-pointed star eclipsed by a crescent, all enclosed in a square marked with today's date. He said, only this, 12 ropes on this day will tangle, not in the air, in memory. The judge hesitated. The governor, furious, ordered the execution to proceed anyway. But Rashid, the executioner, refused. He said, quietly, I will cut when the sky agrees. And he left. The governor had no replacement, trained. The crowd grew restless. as the 12 men were returned to their cells. 3 days later, a riot broke out in the northern quarter of the city, not because of the postponed execution, but because grain had spoiled in the market. And rumors spread of poison. The riots lasted 6 days. The deaths, 24. Barrows was never blamed. But the calendar was not challenged again. The 12 traitors, they were executed weeks later under a waxing moon, on the 14th day of the 6th month, neutral date. Asterisk. It was quiet, clean, unremarkable. And that was the point, because Persian justice didn't always seek drama. It sought alignment, and with them, something else vanished. The pause, the last execution tied to a celestial alignment, took place in 1897 in a southern court near Shiraz. The prisoner, a man accused of conspiracy against a local noble, was set to be hanged at dawn. But the executioner, an old man named Sorish, had learned from his father, and his father before him, that the 7th of Aben, when it falls on a Monday during a waning moon, was a sealed day. A day when the air refused to carry the weight of judgment. When the ground held echoes too long. Tess, when ropes tightened too late. So Rush brought this to the magistrate's attention, quietly, respectfully, but the magistrate laughed. "The only moon I serve is printed in Paris," he said, "and it says, today is clear." So the execution went ahead. The scaffold was prepared, the noose tied. The prisoner read his sentence, but when the lever was pulled, something faltered. The beam cracked. The prisoner fell not to his death but onto the scaffold floor. The rope had twisted. The knot had seized. He gasped, not dead, but broken, bloodied, half strangled. The crowd panicked. The guards rushed. A second rope was brought. The act was finished. But the silence that followed was not the solemn hush of a completed sentence. It was discomfort, unease. The magistrate ordered the scaffold burned. Sarash resigned the next day. That night, he returned home and laid out the old calendar scrolls. Once modesty faded, nearly forgotten. He ran his fingers along the dates, the markings, a soft brush of ink where his grandfather had once written. The body may yield to the rope, but time will not. It was the last time a Persian execution was postponed due to the stars. In the decades that followed, timekeeping became precise. Watches replaced sundials. Governors sent telegrams, not messengers. And death became scheduled, not considered. But there were those who still remembered. An apprentice, Khan, decades later, told his son, "My master never touched the blade on the 10th day of Tyr. He'd clean his tools, yes, but he wouldn't cut." Said the air was crooked. The son asked, "Did it matter?" And the apprentice replied, "It mattered to him. And sometimes that's enough." Today, in an archive near Tehran, there remains one scroll flattened under glass, preserved more for its craftsmanship than content. It contains 12 concentric circles, each marked with signs, moon phases, seasonal transitions, eclipses, and beneath them, faint notes in faded Farsi. One reads, "This day is not a blade's day." There is no record of what happened on that day. No names, no sentence, no death. Only the space where something might have happened, but DID. So now we must ask, what have we lost by cutting time into even slices, by erasing the breath between guilt and death? And when we stopped asking the sky for permission, did we gain justice or just efficiency? Asterisk. Before the blade was drawn, before the name was read, before the crowd hushed and the guard stepped back, there was the carpet, spread carefully beneath the feet of the executioner, not for comfort, not for decoration, but to mark the space where death would occur. It was called the far shikatema, literally, the carpet of ending, woven not for palaces, not for prayer, for the precise moment a life ended in public. You would not find these carpets in the homes of merchants, nor under the feet of scholars. You would not find them hung on walls or carried in dowries. They were not displayed. They were not signed. They were not sold. And yet, in every city where the blade, Roses Fahan, Tabriz, Yez, Chirazu, would find one, folded neatly, waiting in the shadows of the scaffold. Always the same dimensions, 6 feet by 4. Wool, never silk. Red, always. Red, though not bright, never crimson. A dull, dark red. The color of dried pomegranate skin. The color of something remembered, not freshly bled. At first glance, the carpet seemed simple, but look closer and you would see a single black border, interrupted at each corner by a knot that looked like a closed eye. A field of faded geometric vines, looping endlessly, never broken. And at the center, a single woven circle, offset slightly toward the eastern edge. That circle was where the blade would fall, not by design, but by ritual. The executioner knew he would center his stance just west of it. The condemned would kneel with their neck aligned to its curve. Okay, the blade, when drawn, would pass across that space. The carpet caught the weight of the moment, and then it was rolled up, quietly, by the apprentice. Why a carpet? Why bring softness to a place of violence? Because, in Persia, even endings had to touch the earth with dignity. The carpet did more than cushion knees, kutika, not for drama, kutika, for clarity. It separated the act from the chaos of the square. When a man died on stone, the blood ran wild. The air grew hot. The ground cracked beneath the noise. But when he died on Wolon, a pattern woven by quiet hands in the hills. Near Kashand, the moment passed, contained, not sanitized, not hidden, just honored. And the carpets were not new. They were always old, used, but not worn. They were passed down like tools shipped between cities, stored in thick cedar boxes, marked only by year and court seal. Some carpets had witnessed hundreds of deaths, and each time they were washed, not scrubbed, not bleached, washed by hand, in a narrow stream, with ash, not soap, because soap was for living skin, ash was for memory. There's a note from the quartermasters. Its records in 1843. Carpet from Shiraz returned. 6 deaths this quarter. Fine pattern frayed at center. Prepared by Lili of the southern loom. Okay. Washed beneath crescent moon, as instructed. Okay. Lili was not a name that appears in court documents. Okay. But among carpet weavers, her name was spoken with reverence. She repaired the carpets of ending. She retied the knots that bore the weight of the condemned, and she worked in silence. No loom, just needle, one hand for holding, one for binding. Sometimes the wool still held the faint scent of vinegar, sometimes not. She never asked what the carpet had seen. She just asked, was the circle still unbroken? 'Cause, if it was native, the woven circle at the center had frayed or torn, then the carpet had failed. The space of death had unraveled, and someone would suffer. There's a superstition among older executioners. If the carpet breaks, the blade slips.